The courtroom was modest in size, with beige walls that seemed to absorb the quiet murmurs of the few attendees. Judge Samuel Harris sat at the front, behind his mahogany bench, his gavel polished from years of use. He had been on the bench for nearly 2 decades, known for his sharp mind and an unwavering belief in the strict adherence to the law. Over the years, he had earned a reputation as someone who didn't easily bend the rules, no matter the circumstances. His philosophy was simple: the law is the law, and it's meant to be followed, no exceptions. Maya Davis, dressed in a simple black dress, sat in the defendant's chair, her eyes unwavering as she listened to the prosecutor detail her minor infraction. The charge was driving without a valid license. She had moved recently to the city, and though she had tried to update her paperwork, there had been complications at the DMV. The error was unintentional. Maya wasn't a criminal. She wasn't someone who had spent time in jail or courted trouble. But Judge Harris didn't know that. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and she maintained a calm composure throughout the proceedings. There was a slight shift in her posture when the prosecutor mentioned the fine: $500. It was a significant amount, more than she could comfortably afford, but Maya had been through tougher situations. She was a determined woman, one who believed in herself even when others might not. But she also understood the legal system and the weight of the words being spoken in that room. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, Your Honor," Maya said, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet resolve. "I was working on resolving the issue with the DMV before this happened, but I wasn't able to finalize everything in time. I will pay the fine as soon as possible." Judge Harris didn't flinch at her words. He had heard similar pleas from defendants countless times, and most often, they came from people who were quick to make excuses. He glanced at the case file in front of him, noting her name and the lack of a prior criminal record. Despite this, he didn't feel the need to extend any leniency. He had made up his mind. "Ms. Davis, the law doesn't make exceptions for minor oversights or personal hardships," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "The fine stands. $500, payable within 30 days. Maya nodded silently, though the slight furrow in her brow betrayed the frustration she felt. She didn't argue. There was no point in it. In that moment, she knew that arguing against the fine would only escalate the situation, and it would have no bearing on the outcome. Judge Harris made his decision, and it was final. As the proceedings came to a close, Maya gathered her belongings and stood to leave. As she turned to walk out of the courtroom, she caught a glimpse of Judge Harris watching her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something there, something that caused a flicker of doubt in his mind, a brief moment of hesitation. But it was fleeting, and soon the gavel was raised. The courtroom emptied, and both their lives continued on different paths. Later that evening, Maya Davis walked through the bustling streets of the city, the evening air cool against her skin. The courthouse, with its austere gray walls and the tense energy that filled the room, felt like a distant memory now. She was used to dealing with systems and bureaucracies that didn't always recognize the humanity behind the paperwork. After all, Maya had spent the better part of her adult life navigating the intricacies of financial regulations, policy frameworks, and systemic challenges within government institutions. Arriving at her apartment, a modest but cozy unit in an old brick building, she set her purse down on the kitchen counter. The evening light filtered in through the window, casting soft shadows across her desk cluttered with papers. It was here that Maya spent most of her nights, drafting proposals and regulations for one of the most ambitious financial reform projects in the country, an initiative aimed at addressing the racial and economic disparities in the financial system. At the age of 37, Maya had already become a rising star in Washington, working behind the scenes with influential policymakers, economists, and legal experts. Her job was to design new financial frameworks that would make the banking system more inclusive for marginalized communities, especially the underbanked, who were often left out of traditional banking services. She had a particular focus on addressing the historical inequities that had denied generations of Black families access to capital and financial stability. Her work had earned her accolades from some of the most prestigious institutions in the country. She was often asked to speak at conferences, write policy papers, and advise high-ranking government officials on issues of financial justice. But despite her growing reputation, Maya rarely sought the limelight. She preferred to stay in the background, quietly pushing forward the reforms she believed could change the nation's financial landscape for the better. As Maya opened her laptop to begin reviewing new draft regulations for the Federal Reserve, she reflected on the day's events. The fine that Judge Harris had imposed was a setback, but it wasn't something that could derail her. She had been through far more difficult situations, years of schooling while working multiple jobs, navigating a field dominated by white men, and challenging entrenched systems that seemed designed to keep her down. This minor infraction was nothing in comparison. But as she sat there, the weight of the day's encounter lingered in her mind. The judge's face, stern yet somehow detached, seemed to haunt her. She had felt a faint undercurrent of judgment from him. And though she wasn't one to easily be rattled, it bothered her. Maybe it was the way he looked at her as she stood before him, like he couldn't quite place her. She was just another person caught up in the gears of the legal system, but in reality, she was anything but ordinary. Maya sighed, then returned to her work. She didn't have time to dwell on the courtroom. There were policies to finalize, and the fight for financial equality wasn't going to wait. Judge Samuel Harris sat at his desk that evening, reviewing his case notes for the day. The courthouse had emptied, but his mind was still occupied with the cases that had passed through his courtroom. He'd heard dozens of cases like Maya Davis, a routine infraction with a predictable outcome. It was the kind of case that didn't demand much thought. And yet something about Maya's demeanor lingered in his mind. Her calm, composed presence had been almost too serene for someone facing a fine that could pose a significant financial burden. For some reason, Judge Harris couldn't shake the thought of her. It was a slight mystery, and for someone like him, accustomed to dealing in absolutes, mystery often nagged at him until it was solved. He stared at his computer screen, his fingers hovering over the keys, unsure why he couldn't simply let go of the case like he had so many others. He typed her name into the search bar. What appeared before him was an article from a major financial news outlet. Maya Davis was not just an ordinary woman. She was one of the leading experts in economic reform and had been instrumental in drafting a new set of federal financial regulations aimed at promoting economic equity in banking. The article described her work with the Federal Reserve, her role in advocating for policies that sought to close the wealth gap between Black and white communities, and her involvement in groundbreaking legislation that would regulate predatory lending practices. Judge Harris leaned back in his chair, surprised. He had assumed that Maya was just another defendant in his courtroom, perhaps someone struggling with finances or caught in a moment of misfortune. He had never considered that someone like her, an architect of national policy, could end up before him over something as minor as an unintentional traffic violation. The more he read, the more his perception of Maya shifted. She was no ordinary woman. Maya was shaping the future of financial policy in the United States, working tirelessly to make sure that marginalized communities had access to the same opportunities as wealthier, more privileged ones. And here she was, sitting in his courtroom, like any other defendant, reduced to a moment of vulnerability because of a bureaucratic oversight. He found himself intrigued. Maya's background was vastly different from the people he usually saw in his courtroom. He wondered how someone with her expertise could have found herself tangled in such a minor legal issue. The more he thought about it, the more a sense of shame crept over him. He realized that, for the first time in a long while, he might have misjudged someone. He clicked on another link, searching for more about Maya's work. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. There was something deeper here, something worth understanding. With a sigh, Judge Harris made a decision. He would reach out to Maya Davis. It was a small gesture, perhaps, but it could be the first step toward bridging the gap between what he had seen in his courtroom and the larger, more complex world she inhabited. He needed to learn more. A few days later, Judge Harris found himself at a conference on economic reform at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. It wasn't the type of event he typically attended, but when he had seen that Maya Davis was scheduled to give a keynote address, his curiosity had gotten the better of him. He had no real reason to be there, other than his desire to understand more about the woman he had found. And yet, as he entered the large conference room, he felt an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. The room buzzed with energy as Maya took the stage. She was poised, confident, and commanding in a way that immediately captured the attention of everyone in the room. Her presence was magnetic, and Judge Harris could sense that this wasn't a woman who was simply an expert in her field. She was someone who had dedicated her life to a cause far larger than herself. As she began to speak, the audience was drawn into her narrative. Maya spoke about the centuries-old systemic barriers that had excluded Black Americans from full participation in the financial system. She outlined the challenges of predatory lending, the racial wealth gap, and the lack of access to capital for communities of color. But she didn't just highlight the problems. Maya offered concrete solutions. She spoke passionately about a new set of financial regulations that would create pathways to financial security for marginalized populations, and how these reforms could be transformative for future generations. Judge Harris, sitting near the back of the room, listened intently. He hadn't expected to be moved, but Maya's words struck a chord within him. He had always believed in fairness, but her speech forced him to confront a reality he had never fully grasped: the extent to which systemic inequality permeated the structures he had long upheld in his legal career. The numbers, the statistics, the policies she discussed, they weren't just abstract concepts to Maya. They were personal, rooted in her own lived experience and the experiences of those she represented. When the session ended, Judge Harris found himself wanting to speak with her, to understand more of what drove her. He approached the podium, where Maya was surrounded by a small group of colleagues. His heart raced slightly, unsure of how she would respond to his presence. After all, she had no reason to know him beyond that brief, formal encounter in his courtroom. Maya turned as he approached, her eyes scanning him for a moment before recognition set in. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with a polite smile. Judge Harris introduced himself, his voice slightly hesitant. I'm Judge Samuel Harris. We met a few days ago, in court, he said, feeling the weight of the situation pressing on him. I want to apologize for what happened. I had no idea who you were at the time. What you're doing, it's important. I didn't realize the scope of your work. Maya studied him for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. After a brief pause, she nodded. Thank you, she said, her voice calm yet laced with curiosity. It's not often I get an apology from someone in your position, but I appreciate it. What did you think of the speech? Judge Harris hesitated for a moment before replying. It made me realize how little I truly understood about the financial world beyond the courtroom. I think I need to learn more. Maya smiled faintly, her eyes softening. It's a complex system, but we can start by talking. The encounter, brief as it was, set the stage for a new kind of dialogue between them. A conversation not just about laws and regulations, but about empathy, understanding, and a shared responsibility for creating a fairer society. In the days following the conference, Judge Harris couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Maya. The more he reflected on it, the more he realized how far removed he had been from the world she inhabited. He had spent his career immersed in legal cases, adhering to the rule of law without ever truly questioning the broader systems those laws were meant to uphold. But Maya's words had stirred something inside him. She had challenged him to reconsider his assumptions about fairness and justice, pushing him to look beyond the surface of the laws he had enforced for so many years. He found himself at a crossroads. Should he return to his familiar, unquestioned approach to justice, or should he take a deeper look at the people who came before him, understanding not just their actions but the circumstances that led them there? Maya's speech had been a turning point. The layers of her work, advocating for financial equity in a system that often ignored the struggles of marginalized communities, had been a revelation. He now saw that the law wasn't just about punishment, it was about understanding context, history, and the systemic issues that influenced individual actions. He had been so focused on the letter of the law, so sure that his judgments were fair, that he had never considered the larger picture. Judge Harris sat in his office late one evening, his desk covered with papers from his latest cases, but his mind kept drifting back to Maya. Her calm, confident demeanor at the conference had made an impression on him, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he hadn't truly apologized for how he had treated her in court. The fine, the quick dismissal, he had acted like she was just another defendant with no story, no purpose beyond her transgression. He hadn't even taken a moment to consider who she was or what she had achieved. A surge of guilt washed over him. He decided then and there that he would reach out to Maya, not just to apologize again, but to begin a real dialogue. He grabbed a pen and wrote a letter, unsure if she would even respond, but hoping she might give him the chance to explain himself. In his letter, he admitted his mistake. He acknowledged that, in that courtroom, he had judged her based on a superficial moment, failing to see the depth of her contributions to the world. He expressed a desire to learn more about her work, to understand how she had become such a powerful force in financial reform. He also asked for her forgiveness, not just for the fine, but for his lack of empathy in the moment. When the letter was finally sent, Judge Harris felt a mix of anxiety and relief. He had taken a step that, in many ways, was unfamiliar to him. He had stepped out of his rigid judicial mindset and reached out as a human being, not just as a judge. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, a sign that he was ready to grow, to see the world from a broader perspective. Weeks passed without a response. Judge Harris tried not to dwell on it, but the uncertainty lingered. Still, he hoped that somehow, this newfound openness would lead to a change in the way he saw his role in the justice system, and perhaps, just perhaps, open the door to a lasting connection with Maya. The letter had been sitting on Maya's desk for nearly a week before she finally opened it. Her initial hesitation had been rooted in a mix of curiosity and skepticism. She wasn't sure what to expect. Was it just a formal apology, or a deeper attempt to bridge the divide that had existed between her and Judge Harris? After all, it wasn't every day that a judge reached out to someone they had just fined, especially someone as deeply involved in national policy as she was. Maya took a deep breath as she read the letter. Judge Harris had been straightforward, acknowledging his mistake and admitting that he had never fully grasped the broader context of her work when he had sentenced her in court. He had asked for her forgiveness, not only for the fine, but for failing to see her as someone more than just a defendant. He expressed a genuine desire to learn more about her contributions to financial reform and seemed to want to engage in a meaningful conversation. Maya placed the letter down on the desk and sat back in her chair, processing the words. The apology was sincere, but what struck her most was the underlying willingness to change. It wasn't just about the mistake in court. It was about a man who was willing to step outside of his narrow worldview, to question his own assumptions, and to grow. She had encountered many people in her life who clung to their biases, refusing to change even when presented with facts. But here was a judge, someone who could easily dismiss her as just another defendant, willing to admit that perhaps he didn't have all the answers. After a moment of contemplation, Maya picked up the phone and dialed the number provided at the end of the letter. She had been uncertain at first, but there was something about his message that spoke to her. He wasn't just asking for forgiveness. He was opening the door to something deeper, an exchange of ideas, perspectives, and possibly a chance to influence change in the very systems she had been working to reform. When Judge Harris answered, his voice was tentative but warm. "Hello, Judge Harris here. Ms. Davis, I wasn't sure if you would respond, but I truly appreciate you taking the time." Maya smiled, the tension in her own voice slipping away. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said in your letter. I wasn't expecting an apology, but it seems like you're truly trying to understand. That's rare. So yes, I'm open to talking." The conversation that followed was unexpected, at least for both of them. They didn't discuss the fine or the legality surrounding it. Instead, they found themselves speaking openly. Maya about her work, her experiences growing up in an underserved community, and her desire to make financial systems work for people who had historically been left behind. Judge Harris, in turn, spoke of his years on the bench, how he had always believed in the law's impartiality, and how he was now grappling with the realization that the law alone didn't address the complexities of people's lives. They spoke for hours that evening, exchanging perspectives in a way neither had anticipated. By the time they hung up, there was a sense of mutual respect, a connection forged through honest conversation. From that day on, their dialogues became more frequent. It wasn't just a judge and an expert debating policy. It was two people learning from one another, navigating a journey of understanding, and slowly, in their own ways, breaking down the walls that separated them. As weeks passed, Maya and Judge Harris' conversations grew more frequent, moving from occasional phone calls to regular meetings. The initial awkwardness faded quickly, replaced by a shared sense of purpose and a deepening respect for each other's perspectives. Maya, with her profound understanding of the financial system's failings, and Judge Harris, with his extensive experience in the legal world, had begun to see how their knowledge could complement each other. Judge Harris had been astonished by the depth of the financial regulations Maya was working to shape, especially those targeting inequities he hadn't even known existed. He listened as Maya explained how systemic racism in the banking industry had not only disenfranchised Black communities for generations, but had actively created cycles of poverty that made it nearly impossible for marginalized people to build wealth. It was an eye-opening conversation that made him feel, for the first time in his life, like he was truly understanding the layers of discrimination and economic injustice. Maya, too, began to see a side of the law that was new to her. Judge Harris didn't just interpret the law, he lived it daily. He spoke of the frustrations of being a judge in a world where courtrooms often seemed to serve only the powerful and the privileged. He had seen firsthand how the system penalized those who were most vulnerable, particularly the poor and people of color, and he admitted that, before meeting Maya, he had never fully appreciated how much the system itself contributed to the inequality he had witnessed. Their conversations soon evolved into brainstorming sessions. Maya would explain her proposals for financial reforms, and Judge Harris would offer insights on how the legal framework might support or hinder her ideas. They discussed everything from the enforcement of anti-predatory lending laws to ways the justice system could better accommodate people caught in a cycle of poverty. Maya would share examples of successful policy changes from other countries, and Judge Harris would weigh in with practical considerations for implementing such ideas within the U.S. legal system. Their work together began to bear fruit. Judge Harris, inspired by Maya's work, took a more active role in advocating for financial reforms, pushing for the creation of a specialized task force to explore racial disparities in the legal and banking systems. Maya, in turn, incorporated more legal perspectives into her policy drafts, ensuring that the language would be more enforceable within the existing structures of American law. It wasn't long before their collaboration became public. They were invited to speak at conferences together, where they shared their journey from adversaries in a courtroom to partners in reform. Their partnership was an unlikely one, an African-American financial expert and a white judge. But it was one that resonated deeply with audiences who saw in them the potential for real change. What had started as an apology, a simple attempt at understanding, had blossomed into something far more impactful. They were no longer just an expert and a judge. They were allies working together to dismantle the very systems they had once navigated separately. Their combined efforts were beginning to draw the attention of policymakers, who began to see the possibility of real systemic change. The partnership between Maya and Judge Harris was proving that it wasn't just about individual actions. It was about coming together, understanding the complexity of each other's worlds, and using that shared knowledge to drive tangible change. Months passed, and Maya and Judge Harris's collaborative efforts began to yield visible, tangible results. The task force they had pushed for was established, and soon after, the first wave of reforms they had worked on together were being considered in Washington. As they navigated the complex intersection of financial systems and legal frameworks, they began to see their proposals slowly but surely take shape, gaining support from policymakers who had once been skeptical about the depth of the issues at hand. Their partnership was not without challenges. The political landscape was a battleground of competing interests, and despite the goodwill they had earned, there were still those resistant to change. But Maya and Judge Harris refused to be deterred. The more they worked together, the more they realized that systemic change was an uphill battle, but one that was worth fighting. They had come to understand that reforming the financial system wasn't about eliminating all the obstacles at once. It was about chipping away at them, one step at a time. Maya had long advocated for policies that would regulate exploitative lending practices, promote financial literacy in underserved communities, and create pathways for wealth building in Black and other marginalized communities. Thanks to Judge Harris's support, these ideas began to gain real traction. Together, they helped craft legislation that incentivized banks to offer affordable loans to low-income individuals and communities of color, and their efforts led to increased oversight of payday lenders and credit bureaus that often took advantage of vulnerable people. The media had picked up on their partnership as well, calling it an unlikely but powerful alliance. They were hailed as a model of how collaboration between different sectors, law, finance, and policy, could create change. For Maya, seeing the work she had dedicated her life to finally being embraced by the broader public felt like a victory. But even more rewarding was the realization that Judge Harris had become an advocate in his own right, using his position to raise awareness of financial injustice within his judicial circles. Over time, their relationship deepened beyond work. They had forged a genuine friendship, one rooted in mutual respect, shared values, and a common commitment to social justice. Maya often joked that Judge Harris was the most surprising ally she had ever had, and he would laugh, admitting that he had never imagined a person like her would be the catalyst for changing his views on the very system he had spent decades defending. Years later, when Maya's financial reforms were fully implemented and the nation began to see measurable improvements in wealth equity, it was clear that their work together had left an indelible mark. They had done more than just reform the financial system. They had set a precedent for how people from different backgrounds and fields could come together to challenge systemic inequalities. When they looked back on their journey, neither of them could have predicted where it would lead. What began as a courtroom encounter between a judge and a defendant had grown into a transformative partnership, one that changed the lives of thousands, if not millions. Together, they had written a new chapter in the story of justice, one where understanding, collaboration, and empathy were the keys to lasting change.